One of the most significant moments of the Trump presidency, thanks to Justice Anthony Kennedy's stunning announcement today. He used the end of this week's momentous court term to say officially he's retiring this month. Kennedy broke the news in a traditionally terse letter, so we don't know why he chose today. But I'll tell you this tonight. There is much hyperbole and drama these days. So let's begin this newscast with something I've never said before on this show. The filling of this vacancy is the most significant domestic development in American legal and political life since Donald Trump's election. And apart from matters of war and peace, this is the most far-reaching decision Donald Trump will make. And that presents a remarkable test for how Congress and the Democrats respond. So before we go any further, we like to begin with substance around here. Let's look at why Kennedy is more pivotal than some other justices. On this divided court, he often broke the ties, delivering the controversial Bush victory in Bush v. Gore, writing the hotly debated First Amendment decision protecting money as speech in Citizens United, and siding with Donald Trump yesterday on that travel ban. And when this court has narrowly leaned towards executive power or conservative causes, Kennedy was the one either helping or holding the line. And when it was time for this Supreme Court in the last years to do what many progressives thought of as moving this nation forward, Kennedy was the experienced Republican appointee ushering in new eras, like his historic ruling joining Democratic appointees on the court to define the right to same-sex marriage, the law of the land today, or to take on tough national security arguments after 9/11 and rule that even accused terrorists at Guantanamo Bay have due process rights. We've heard a lot about due process in the last week. He also issued an order that limited but still upheld affirmative action as a way to advance diversity and campuses around the country. And he wrote the most far-reaching decision protecting women against the government putting a burden on their medical and abortion rights, a case that the GOP has now targeted for decades. So when you think about those rights or cases, when you reflect on an America forged throughout that history, when you hear those decisions, you're hearing the echo of Justice Kennedy's unusual approach on the court. A conservative, to be sure, but a conservative who believed there are times when the high court must lead the nation towards a model of incremental judicial progress.
Very dramatic moment here, a 5-4 decision written by Justice Anthony Kennedy. This is a total victory for the advocates of same-sex marriage.
The court has ruled that foreign terror suspects held at Guantanamo Bay have the right under the Constitution to challenge their detention in U.S. civilian courts.
By a 4-3 vote, the Supreme Court has upheld the affirmative action program at the University of Texas in an opinion written by Justice Anthony Kennedy.
An opinion written by Justice Anthony Kennedy. When those of us who follow the court would see it was a Kennedy opinion, you knew it meant something. Often you knew it was 5-4. You didn't necessarily know which way it was going. With Kennedy leaving, every one of those cases could be wiped right off the board if a Trump-style conservative takes his place and gets the same kind of case. Without Kennedy, those cases we know would be decided pretty differently, which is what Trump's allies think he promised today.
We will begin our search for a new justice of the United States Supreme Court that will begin immediately. We have a very excellent list of great talented, highly educated, highly intelligent, hopefully tremendous people. So it will be somebody from that list.
From that list, which is a reference, a clear message to Trump's base, because in contrast to all of the unplanned and spontaneous moves he's made as president, when you think about the travel ban or the border fracas, Trump did not just make up his last SCOTUS appointment as he went along. He used this list that you see on the screen, and Senate Leader Mitch McConnell now clamoring for a quick vote, contradicting his own previous position that election years are no time to rush towards a hearing on SCOTUS.
We will vote to confirm Justice Kennedy's successor this fall.
Will Justice Garland, Judge Garland, get a hearing?
No, I don't think so. This nominee is not going to be considered.
Mitch McConnell, of course, broke over a century of precedent with that kind of hardball, and it worked to deny Barack Obama his appointment. Tonight, there are activists calling for payback and exploring plans to shut down the Senate or somehow the whole government to try to give McConnell the McConnell treatment. So we may be entering uncharted territory. with the highest stakes decision of the Trump era that will outlast the Trump era. Because this becomes actuarial at a certain point. A young replacement for Kennedy could rule for 2 or 3 or even 4 decades, raising fundamental questions about where we go from here. And I say all that, that's all the legal substance, before you even consider the extra fact that Donald Trump will be picking a jurist who could ultimately rule on whether Trump, a president who came under criminal investigation earlier than any other president in history, whether Trump must turn over evidence or ultimately give testimony in Bob Mueller's Russia probe. I am joined by an esteemed panel: Maya Wiley, an attorney and former counsel to the mayor of New York City; presidential historian Jon Meacham, who knows his way around these White House decisions; and Jeffrey Rosen, president and CEO of the National Constitution Center. I begin with Maya, but same question for everyone. What is the significance of Kennedy if it moves towards a Trump-style jurist?
Well, what we're going to see is another Gorsuch. Gorsuch is going to be much more of a flag bearer for the Trump administration. Justice Kennedy wasn't really a swing vote. I think it's actually the wrong way to think about him, and he himself purportedly hates that term. Most of his votes actually went with the conservative majority, and most of the votes that were 5-4, he went with the conservative majority, although you point to some really important ones where he was more of an incrementalist. I think we're going to see someone much more ideological in terms of their activism on the court. I think we're also going to see that the view on Roe v. Wade is very much one that's going to become an unspoken litmus test, but it won't come out quite frontally when any of the candidates for this seat are being vetted, because nobody wants to blow this up, and that will certainly be one that will rally the Democratic base.
You know, the age of Reagan ended today. His last appointee, Justice O'Connor, Justice Scalia, Justice Kennedy. We're now in a court where there's one Bush 41 appointee, and then Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama. This was the payoff for Republicans who decided, once Trump had hijacked the party and the base had sided with him, that they were willing to vote for Trump because they did not want a President Hillary Clinton making the decision we are being confronted with today. And that basically there were 2 reasons, it seems to me, that Trump won with that part of the party. One was fewer taxes, and the other was more justices.
Mm-hmm. Jeffrey?
So the difference between Justice Kennedy and a Justice Gorsuch is the difference between an originalist and a advocate of natural law jurisprudence. Justice Kennedy was willing to find rights of privacy and dignity in the Constitution that a Justice Gorsuch or another Trump appointee would not. And that's why it's true that Roe could be chipped back or overturned and new privacy rights not extended. But I don't think it's right that a future Trump nominee wouldn't check the president if he threw journalists in jail. Even a self-pardon might be challenged. The truth is that originalist conservative justices are willing to enforce limits on the presidency and Congress when they think the text and history of the Constitution supports it. So although the impact of Justice Kennedy's retirement will be as huge as you suggested, Ari, it may be more in a lack of a willingness to strike down state laws in the way Justice Kennedy was, but the same willingness to strike down federal laws. Kennedy voted to strike down more state and federal laws than any justice on the Roberts and Rehnquist court, and the new appointees may be slightly more deferential to state experimentation.
Part of this also goes to what Donald Trump promised. Again, the theory of the case that he is a kind of a quote-unquote sloppy idiot is really rebutted by a lot of his actions, and a lot of them are in the legal space because there's actual lines in the law. He loves and seems to delight in breaking other types of norms. But he, as a marketer, figured out that people cared, as Jon Meacham was saying, a great deal about this particular issue. Take a listen to him on the campaign trail, sticking to the talking points.
It's our last chance, and that includes Supreme Court justices and Second Amendment. Remember that.
We need a Supreme Court that, in my opinion, is going to uphold the Second Amendment. The justices that I'm going to appoint will be pro-life.
This is your final shot for the Supreme Court, for your Second Amendment. I mean, this is your final shot, November 8th.
So, Jeffrey, to that point, Final shot, he mentions abortion there. I mean, if you had a Gorsuch-style judge in place of Kennedy, the last big case I mentioned, 1992, Planned Parenthood v. Casey, defending women's rights in that regard, don't you think it would go quite differently?
Roe could be overturned. Justice Stevens told me a few years ago he thought it would be with another conservative nominee once Kennedy retired. But it's not clear that the effect would be as dramatic as pro-choice people rightly fear. Justice Ginsburg told me in an interview just a few years ago that the real impact of the overturning of Roe would be on poor women who already don't have access to abortion in the red states where it's not really available. So although it would be huge symbolically and could really redefine the Republican Party, because remember, after all, there are plenty of pro-choice Republicans who are willing to vote GOP as long as the court kept the issue out of the political arena. It's not clear that the overturning of Roe would be the most dramatic thing that could follow a Kennedy retirement. There will be lots of other important changes as well.
Maya?
Well, I actually would say that it would be quite significant, and one reason is demographic, because poor women, first of all, are actually a growing part of the population thanks to income and wealth inequality. If you want to talk about some southern states, you're talking about 55% of the black population, and where the Latino population is growing rapidly. So you're actually talking about essentially barring a huge percentage of women from huge swaths of the country from access to something that should be safe, should be fully within their control to determine whether or not it's medically appropriate for them, with access to a physician who's qualified to give them medical guidance. One of the things that Justice Kennedy left us with as part of his legacy is an incredible incursion into that in yesterday's opinion. So in the actual lived experience of women in this country, it would be quite significant.
Quite significant. And John, I have a member of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate about to join us for a very pivotal discussion because they have a vote here. But to Maya's point, I wonder if you could widen us out to history. You cover and you explore how we get where we get.
Right.
And there are things that seem to happen sometimes accidentally. I don't know if it makes it harder for you to write the history book, but
it makes it more fun.
When you look at what Maya's talking about with women's rights, when we think about civil rights, we think about affirmative action, which I mentioned. We think about the rights of people accused of terrorism and where Kennedy fit in, and we know how much it could change. And all of this coming out of a 2016 election that was very close. Where the Electoral College winner got fewer votes. And are we looking at really the changing of America in a fundamental sense?
Well, it's actually a rearguard action to some extent. Having a Republican president, as Jeffrey says, appointing originalists, when you have the demographic shifts, the cultural shifts, where I think a lot of opinion, particularly among younger Americans, tends toward the libertarian. I think the great next force in American life is going to be libertarianism, which kind of goes along with these demographic changes. The court will either be a force to manage that change, or it could be a reaction to it. And you know, there's a trope in these things, which is sometimes presidents don't know what they're going to get. But the court has been a force ultimately for good. There was Dred Scott, there was Plessy versus Ferguson, but then Earl Warren comes along and really forces the integration issue in a way that the political process is not ready.
I would push you on whether the accurate thing you're saying is changing, because certainly people didn't know what they would get from some judges, but that led to the right saying no more suitors.
That's right.
And these arguments that we are going to fly-spec this. And again, Donald Trump saying, I'll pick off your Federalist Society list, which has very serious religious, sexual, gender, and I would argue racial components to what they want out of the court, sir. Yeah,
and which underscores yet again why it's so important. You know, I don't know where you stand on this, but John Roberts seems to me to be someone who is thinking about what people are going to say when they look at his oil portrait. And I think we saw that with the Obamacare decision. We saw it less so yesterday. But this really, it is so funny to feel these goalposts move up and down the field. So I suspect if I had told you 20 years ago that Anthony Kennedy was going to be the last great catcher in the rye, you would have thought, oh my God, how could that possibly be?
Yeah, because he's no Thurgood Marshall, you're saying.
Exactly. And so it is a sign of how there is this disconnect between, broadly put, those in power on the Republican side and the way the country is changing. And that's why I worry more and more.
Let me give my response, and then I want to bring in Senator Blumenthal, who is, as 50 Cent would say, patiently waiting. But you hear John Meacham there say that, and he sounds a little bit like James Earl Jones reading 1984, in that John is such a classy, calm presence that the way he delivers this message would still, if you hear what he's saying to a lot of people at home watching this, would think, okay, everything's going to hell. Although you put it very artfully.
I've never been compared to James Earl Jones. I'm going home. I'm calling it a day.
Because this is, to many people, when you look at the progress, and just on marriage equality, you say this was a huge deal, and it affects people's lives, and it was a lot of people view that as a notion of progress, and it could be ripped away by Donald Trump next month.
What the election in 2016 represented was the resistance to the gains of the civil rights movement, of the women's rights movement, of the gay rights movement, of all the movements in the country who had spent the 20th century struggling for full inclusion. What happened there, this is one of the reasons why the court became such an inflection point to the Trump base. And one of the things that has to happen now is Democrats, like Republicans have done historically, have to look at the court as a critically important power lever to say, are we going to have the kind of leadership in our balance of governmental power that is actually paying attention to whether or not, as John said, we have a body of government that is not elected, that's appointed, that will look at this from the perspective of a naturally evolving society that has to live without in the framework of rights.
And it goes to what courts are supposed to do, which is day one of law school. There are things that are unpopular that involve constitutional protections that have to be enforced by the courts because the political system won't do it. And that also hangs in the balance tonight. Everyone stays, as promised. Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal, who serves in the Judiciary Committee, who's been with us before. Senator, listen to your colleague Dick Durbin about this vote.
If he's consistent, uses his own rule, we'll wait for 4 months, have an election, and let the American people decide what the majority in Congress will do in the next session.
Are you demanding that standard tonight?
I agree with Dick Durbin. The American people should have a voice. My Republican colleagues should respect their own precedent. A decision on confirmation should take place after the new Congress is seated.
And what are you prepared to do if Mitch McConnell goes forward with what he said, which is he's not going to follow his precedent? His precedent, he's basically publicly admitted, is a hypocrisy that only applies to presidents he doesn't like.
Let's remember first, Ari, the American people should and will understand the momentous importance of this choice. For all the reasons that you discussed earlier, this justice will have a decisive vote, call it a swing vote or a majority maker. But we are in an unparalleled moment of assault on the rule of law when our fundamental liberties are in danger. And we're going to use every tool available, and we will possibly be creative about some new ones in seeking to give the American people a voice. A decision of this historic magnitude requires more deliberate consideration than is possible in the few politically charged months between now and the election.
As you know, sir, there are many people, including within the Democratic Party, who feel the Democrats are always late and soft to these fights. Can you say tonight explicitly what you or your colleagues are prepared to do on the Judiciary Committee or in the Senate to enforce that? Because McConnell's being clear about what he's going to do. Are you prepared to try to shut down the entire Senate, shut down other business to prevent a vote until after the midterms, or are you not prepared to go there tonight?
If the president nominates a right-wing fringe ideologue, I believe that there are colleagues on both sides of the aisle who will stand up to be counted. We will galvanize them, and we will galvanize the American people. And we will use tools, everyone available, to make the public aware of what's at stake here. It's not only reproductive rights and privacy rights and voting rights and clean air and water rights, but also the fundamental rule of law that is at stake. And the American people will understand it, and we'll use every potential tool we have.
Well, that picks up on a point that Maya Wiley, an attorney and an analyst of ours, was making just moments before you joined us. She was arguing that what we are seeing, and that is so significant and that is bigger than some of the other controversies of the Trump era, the rhetoric and the tweets, is we are seeing actually the fruits of a strategy to try to capture the court as a rearguard action to make up in the judicial process what wasn't always able to be won by conservatives in the electoral process, and to try to roll back the rights of women and minorities. Do you agree with that analysis? Do you think that's overstated?
The agenda of all of the potential nominees on some of the lists I've seen is, in fact, to roll back Roe v. Wade and other deeply established, long accepted decisions of this court in defiance of one of the jurisprudential principles, you're well aware of it, that courts should respect long established precedent. And the president himself has said that he will nominate justices who would, and I'm quoting him, I think, directly, automatically overrule Roe v. Wade.
Right.
That is unacceptable.
Stay with me, Maya. Did you want to respond or have a question for the senator?
Well, Senator, you said something, I think, two important things. One is, if it's a really ideological appointee, what's ideological, what's too ideological? And the second is, what are some of those rule tools that you might identify that would actually potentially change the outcome and enable more voice for the American people?
I served as a law clerk for a Supreme Court justice, Justice Blackmun, who, by the way, was the author of Roe v. Wade the year before I clerked for him. And I've also argued cases before the Supreme Court, 4 of them. My basic philosophy is that I want a fair and open-minded judge or justice who will consider the arguments that I make carefully, but will adhere to the rule of law, established precedent, principles and values of freedom and democracy that are at the core of our Constitution. My philosophy is that a person of that intellect and integrity is an absolute requirement. And so we will mobilize the American public, and I'm confident that colleagues on both sides of the aisle will stand up and be counted, because overruling Roe v. Wade, decimating women's health care or privacy rights or marriage equality or any of the other critical progress made over the last decades is really a definite threshold for me.
And finally, I'll say briefly, we are over time, but as I ask you to respond to some of what our experts have said, Jeffrey Rosen, a longtime court watcher, as you know, he went on record tonight on The Beat and said Roe v. Wade could be overturned based on this vacancy. Is that overstated, or do you agree that Roe hangs in the balance as well tonight?
I think even more than Roe hangs in the balance, and Roe does. Our fundamental rights and liberties are threatened now as never before. When the history of this era is written, Ari, I believe that the courts and our free press will be the heroes that preserve democracy, because they stood strong. They disclosed what was happening. They prevented, for example, family separation and other abuses. And I am very, very hopeful that we can fight any right-wing ideologue who chooses to roll back those basic protections. And yes, Roe v. Wade is at risk.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.